My mother-in-law stood on her sweeping suburban porch wrapped in cashmere, pointing a manicured finger at my chest and screaming for me to take my brats and get off her property. My husband, the man who promised to protect me, simply grabbed my diaper bag and launched it into the freezing Chicago blizzard. They locked me and our 10-day-old twins out in the subzero cold, convinced I was just a broke freelance designer with absolutely nowhere to go. They were wrong, so terribly wrong. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through disrespect just to keep the peace. Let me tell you what happened 10 days later, when the ice finally thawed, and I brought the entire storm down on their heads. I am Kendra, 33 years old, and until tonight, I was the dutiful, accommodating wife. The freezing wind whipped off Lake Michigan, slicing right through my thin wool coat. I stood paralyzed on the icy concrete of my mother-in-law's pristine driveway, clutching my 10-day-old twins Zion and Zuri tightly against my chest. The streetlights caught the heavy snowflakes swirling around us, but all I could focus on was the sound of my diaper bag hitting the pavement. Baby formula thermal blankets and wipes spilled out into the dark gray slush. Jamal, my husband of 3 years, stood in the doorway. His broad shoulders completely blocked the warmth of the grand foyer. He did not look like the man who held my hand in the delivery room just over a week ago when our babies arrived slightly premature. He looked exactly like the spineless extension of his mother that he truly was. Loretta loomed behind him, clutching her expensive silk robe tight around her throat. Her voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and venomous. "I told you, Jamal." She shrieked, her tone dripping with that generational wealth snobbery she wore like a badge of honor. "I told you she was a gold-digging fraud. She trapped you with these kids just to secure a spot in our family. She is nothing but a leech trying to climb up the social ladder." I shifted my weight, trying to shield little Zion from the biting wind, as he let out a tiny muffled wail against my collarbone. Jamal did not even flinch at the sound of his newborn son crying in the freezing temperatures. Instead, he looked down at me from the top of the porch steps with a sneer that made my blood run colder than the winter air. "My mother was right," he said, his voice flat and cruel. "I should have married a woman in my own tax bracket, not some struggling freelancer who drains my paycheck every single month." I stared at him. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Drains his paycheck. For 3 years I had played the quiet, humble partner. I swallowed every backhanded compliment Loretta served at her elite Sunday dinners, where she paraded her affluent friends and subtly mocked my modest background. She constantly reminded everyone that I did not pledge the right sorority and did not come from the right neighborhood. I smiled politely when Jamal diminished my career to his corporate finance buddies, calling my staging business a cute little hobby that kept me busy. I let him control the household joint account to stroke his fragile ego, letting him scrutinize my grocery receipts and question every dollar I spent on maternity clothes. I played the struggling creative who needed his guidance because Jamal needed to feel like the absolute king of the castle. He needed to be the sole provider to feel like a man. "You are putting your 10-day-old premature babies out in a blizzard." "Jamal," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the freezing temperature wrapping around my legs. "Do not put this on me, Kendra," he snapped defensively, stepping back into the warmth of the foyer. "You brought this on yourself. You disrespected my mother in her own home." My supposed disrespect was simply asking Loretta to wash her hands before grabbing Zuri out of her bassinet after she had just returned from a crowded gala. But in Loretta's world, boundaries did not apply to her. She demanded absolute submission from everyone in her orbit, and Jamal enforced her reign without question. "You have nowhere to go without my money," Jamal continued, leaning against the doorframe while the snow began to accumulate on my shoulders. "Maybe a night freezing at a bus stop will teach you some gratitude. When you are ready to apologize to my mother and respect her authority, you can call me. Until then, figure it out on your own nickel. I am done subsidizing your life." Loretta stepped forward, a triumphant, arrogant smirk plastered on her perfectly made-up face. "Take your twins and get out, Kendra," she demanded. "You are not dragging my son down anymore. Find some shelter that accepts charity cases." Jamal stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place, echoing loudly over the howling wind. The porch lights snapped off instantly, plunging the driveway into complete darkness. They expected me to pound on the door. They expected me to collapse onto the frozen concrete, sobbing and begging for mercy. They fully believed the cold would break me into a million submissive pieces. They thought I would be crawling back by morning, ready to kiss Loretta's feet just for a warm room and a bottle of formula. I did not shed a single tear. I did not panic. I adjusted my grip on my sleeping babies, wrapping my coat tighter around their tiny, fragile bodies. With my free hand, I reached deep into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were completely steady. I bypassed the joint checking account app and scrolled right past the restrictive budget trackers Jamal monitored so obsessively. I opened my encrypted contacts and dialed my private wealth manager, Malik. The phone rang exactly once before he answered. "Malik," I said, my breath pluming in the freezing air. "I need a transport immediately. Send the secure vehicle to the suburban address." 4 minutes later, the bright LED headlights of a black luxury SUV pierced through the blinding blizzard. The vehicle glided smoothly up the icy driveway, ignoring the gated entry sensors, and stopped right beside me. The driver jumped out immediately, opening the rear door and hastily gathering my spilled diaper bag from the snow. I climbed into the spacious back seat where the heat was already blasting, enveloping Zion and Zuri in instant comforting warmth. As the driver pulled away from the sprawling suburban estate that had been my emotional prison for 3 long years, I looked back at the dark windows of Loretta's house. They thought they had discarded a burden. They did not know they had just unleashed a nightmare. I opened my messaging app, selected Malik's name, and typed a single decisive message: "Execute Protocol Alpha, call." The heavy doors of the luxury SUV closed, shutting out the howling Chicago wind and plunging us into a deeply heated leather interior. My driver, Marcus, did not ask any questions as he took the diaper bag from my frozen fingers. He simply adjusted the climate control and pulled away from the pristine suburban driveway where my husband and mother-in-law had just discarded my children like trash. I held Zion and Zuri close to my chest, feeling their tiny heartbeats steady against my collarbone. The frantic adrenaline that had kept my knees from buckling on that icy concrete began to recede. In its place, a terrifyingly calm and absolute clarity washed over my mind. 4 minutes later, the SUV glided into the private underground parking garage of a downtown luxury high-rise. We bypassed the main lobby entirely. Marcus escorted me to the private elevator, scanning a keycard that took us directly to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling $5,000 a night penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the freezing city below, but inside the air was perfectly warm and fragrant with vanilla and cedar. Miss Helen, my private concierge, had already arranged 2 heated bassinets in the master bedroom, exactly as I had requested through Malik. I laid my babies down side by side. They stretched their tiny limbs completely undisturbed by the fact that their father had just tried to leave them in a blizzard. I walked into the massive marble kitchen and placed my phone on the island. It was vibrating constantly, sliding across the polished stone surface. I picked it up to see a flood of notifications lighting up the screen. Jamal had sent a text message stating I had exactly until tomorrow morning to draft a formal written apology to his mother if I ever wanted to see a dime of his money for baby formula. Loretta had already taken to the extended family group chat, complaining that my dramatic exit and refusal to respect her household rules had completely ruined her evening cup of tea. They were so incredibly predictable. They truly believed they held all the power. They thought they had cast out a helpless, dependent woman who would be crying in a cheap motel by midnight. I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light of the penthouse. For 3 long years, I had played the exact role Jamal assigned to me. When we first met, he was a mid-level corporate finance manager who desperately needed to feel like the smartest and wealthiest person in any room. He thrived on the traditional provider dynamic, so I let him provide. I allowed him to open our joint household checking account. I allowed him to give me a strict monthly allowance for groceries and maternity clothes. Every time my freelance interior design business closed a major deal, I funneled 90% of those profits into a blind trust and deposited a meager 10% into his precious joint account. I smiled and thanked him profusely when he paid the rent. I nodded silently when he lectured me on fiscal responsibility. I shrank my entire existence to fit perfectly inside the tiny, fragile box of his masculine ego. I did it because I believed in peace. I wanted a stable family for my future children. I endured Loretta making snide comments at her church auxiliary meetings about my modest background and my little hobby of a career because I thought submission would eventually earn their respect. But looking at my newborn twins, who were just 10 minutes away from freezing to death on a concrete driveway, I realized that peace was just another word for surrender. I logged into my encrypted banking portal. I clicked on the joint household account. The balance sat at a comfortable $85,000. It was Jamal's pride and joy. This was the exact safety net he had just threatened to withhold from his own flesh and blood. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a second. With 3 deliberate keystrokes, I initiated a sweeping transfer. I did not just take my half of the marital funds, I drained the entire account down to zero. The money routed instantly into a secure offshore holding company that Jamal did not even know existed. But taking his liquid cash was just petty theft. I wanted complete financial annihilation. I navigated away from the personal banking page and logged into my corporate credit portals. Jamal absolutely loved his platinum credit cards. He loved slamming that heavy metal card down at expensive steakhouses to impress his finance colleagues and prove he belonged in his mother's elite social circles. What he did not know, and what he never bothered to actually read when he signed the financial paperwork I slipped in front of him 2 years ago, was that his entire luxury credit profile was heavily subsidized by my corporate entity. He honestly thought his massive credit limit was based on his impressive corporate salary. It was actually backed by the massive commercial real estate staging and development firm I built under a holding name. Kendra Lux Interiors was not a small-time freelance gig operating out of a spare bedroom. We staged and developed luxury commercial high-rises across the entire Midwest. I owned the very penthouse I was currently standing in. I opened the administrative dashboard and highlighted his 3 active platinum accounts. I clicked the option to withdraw corporate backing and instantly revoked my company as the primary guarantor. The screen loaded for a fraction of a second before flashing green with a confirmation message. His credit lines dropped immediately from $250,000 down to a standard $2,000 limit. He just fell from the 1% to the struggling working class in a matter of seconds. He thought he cut me off from his wealth. He had no idea that I was the entire bank. I closed the laptop just as my phone screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Jamal's name. It had only been 20 minutes since he locked me out in the snow, and the financial shockwave had already hit his devices. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked over to the plush leather chair overlooking the city he thought he ran, and watched the phone vibrate against the marble. Let him panic. Let him sweat. The storm was just getting started. The morning sun hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse woke me just before 7. I lay in the oversized king bed for a moment, listening to the soft, synchronized breathing of Zion and Zuri in their heated bassinets nearby. Outside, the blizzard that Jamal and his mother had condemned us to die in was still raging over downtown Chicago, coating the city in a thick sheet of white. Inside my private sanctuary, the temperature was a perfect 72 degrees. A discreet knock at the double doors signaled the arrival of room service arranged by Malik. I wrapped myself in a plush robe and let the attendant wheel in a cart laden with fresh fruit, hot coffee, and warm pastries. I thanked him, tipped him generously, and poured myself a cup of black coffee. As I brought the porcelain cup to my lips, my phone vibrated against the marble nightstand. The screen illuminated with notifications from the family group chat. Jamal had named the chat family first, when we got married, a title that now felt like a sick joke. I unlocked the screen and took a slow sip of my coffee, reading the message that had just come through. It was from Chloe. Chloe was the wife of Jamal's older brother Trey. She was a woman who had built her entire personality around being the perfect, wealthy suburban housewife and the ultimate white savior to our African American family. Her message read exactly like the manipulative performance she had perfected over the years. It said she was so devastated that Kendra chose to abandon her newborn's father in the middle of the night. It continued to say that Jamal was welcome to move in with her and Trey while he sorted out the divorce and that they had the guest room ready for him. She ended the message with a praying hands emoji and a promise to support Jamal through this traumatic betrayal. I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar dark amusement wash over me. Chloe had spent the last 3 years treating me like a charity project Jamal had picked up off the street. At family dinners, she would loudly compliment my resilience for running a struggling little design business. She would bring me unsolicited gifts like discount hair products she claimed would be great for my texture, all while flashing a smile that dared me to complain and look like the angry black woman. She sucked up to Loretta, relentlessly praising her cooking and her home decor, desperate to maintain her status as the favored daughter-in-law. Chloe loved the narrative that Jamal was out of my league. She loved pretending that I was lucky to even be sitting at their dinner table. Now she was spinning the narrative that I had run away in the dead of night, abandoning a loving husband. Jamal had clearly called Trey, sobbing about how I drained the bank account, leaving out the minor detail that he had physically thrown me and 2 premature infants onto an icy driveway in sub-zero temperatures. I set my coffee cup down. I did not feel the need to type out a long emotional paragraph defending my character. I did not need to plead my case to a group of people who had spent years searching for a reason to discard me. I opened my secure files application. When Malik arranged my emergency transport last night, he also dispatched a private pediatric team to the penthouse and coordinated with local law enforcement to document the domestic lockout. I selected 2 high-resolution images. The first was the official police incident report filed at 1 in the morning, clearly detailing a domestic dispute where a mother and 10-day-old infants were locked out of their primary residence during a severe weather emergency. The second image was the digital copy of the pediatric wellness check signed by a top-tier private physician. The medical notes prominently stated the infants had been treated for dangerous exposure to freezing temperatures due to an abrupt residential lockout. I attached both images to the family group chat. I did not add a single word of text, no explanation, no angry demands. I just hit send and watched the read receipts pop up one by one. The silence that followed in that group chat was absolute. The little typing bubbles would appear for a few seconds from Trey, from Chloe, from Jamal's cousins, and then immediately disappear. No one knew how to respond to cold, hard legal and medical documentation proving Jamal had endangered his own children. They were paralyzed. But proving them wrong was not enough. I wanted them to feel the exact same sheer panic they had tried to inflict on me. I swiped out of the messaging application and opened my corporate property management dashboard. Chloe fancied herself a high-end entrepreneur. 2 years ago, she opened a luxury lifestyle boutique in a highly coveted downtown retail district. She sold overpriced beige linen clothing and imported candles. She constantly bragged about how she secured the prime real estate location through her own brilliant business acumen and Jamal's networking connections. She hosted launch parties and treated her retail space like an exclusive clubhouse for her country club friends. What Chloe did not know was that Jamal's connections had absolutely nothing to do with her lease. She had no idea that the holding company that owned the entire retail block was a subsidiary of Kendra Lux Interiors. I was her landlord. I owned the very floor she walked on every single day. When she signed her commercial lease, she had negotiated a heavily discounted month-to-month rate because she claimed she was bringing prestige to the neighborhood. The property management firm had approved it only because I had quietly authorized the discount from behind the scenes, playing the supportive sister-in-law, without ever revealing my identity. I navigated to the tenant directory on my dashboard. I scrolled past dozens of high-paying commercial clients until I found Chloe's LLC. Her boutique was her pride and joy, her entire source of social validation. I clicked on her tenant profile, revealing the active lease agreement. I did not need a reason to terminate a month-to-month commercial lease, but the contract did have a strict morality and public conduct clause. I simply selected the option for immediate lease termination. I typed a brief administrative note stating the property owner was reclaiming the space for immediate redevelopment. The system generated a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the quiet power humming through my fingertips. For years, I had watched Chloe smirk at me across Thanksgiving tables. I had listened to her subtle digs about my finances and my background. Now, with one swift motion, I was dismantling her entire fake empire. I pressed confirm. The system routed the legal eviction notice directly to Chloe's business email, her personal email, and her registered phone number. I locked my phone and picked up my coffee, walking back over to the bassinets to watch my children sleep peacefully. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear, but the devastation I was about to rain down on their family had only just begun. Jamal thought he was dealing with a dependent wife. He was about to find out he had declared war on the very ground they all stood on. My phone lit up again, vibrating aggressively against the marble counter. It was not a group chat notification this time. It was a direct call. The screen flashed with Jamal's name. The financial dominoes were already falling, and the reality of his situation was starting to close in on him. I let it ring. I had no intention of making this easy for him. Let him sit in the panic. Let him realize that every single resource he thought he controlled was slipping right through his fingers. He had wanted a wife who knew her place. I was about to show him exactly where my place was at the top of the food chain. I watched the missed call notification appear right as a new alert popped up from my security team. Jamal was on the move. He was heading straight for the steakhouse where he was scheduled to meet his finance colleagues for a celebratory lunch. He was going to try and pretend his life was not falling apart. He was going to try and buy their expensive meals with his platinum card. I smiled softly to myself, anticipating the moment the waiter would hand that card back to him. The real show was about to start. My phone screen glowed with a new security alert, just as I finished my coffee. Jamal had arrived at Prime Cut, an absurdly overpriced downtown steakhouse, where the waiters wore white gloves and the steaks came wrapped in edible gold. It was his favorite place to hold court with his finance buddies and pretend he was the biggest player in Chicago. I knew his exact routine. He would order top-shelf bourbon, laugh loudly at mediocre jokes, and insist on picking up the check to prove his dominance. For 3 years, I had watched him play this exact game, using the platinum card he loved to flash around. He thought that heavy metal card was a testament to his corporate genius. He had no idea the credit line was tied directly to my corporate accounts. Whenever I attended those steakhouse dinners with him, I was expected to sit quietly and smile while he belittled my work to his colleagues. He would introduce me as his sweet wife, who liked to play with paint swatches. I endured those humiliating evenings because I thought I was protecting his pride and protecting our family unit. I remembered one specific dinner where a colleague asked about my business, and Jamal quickly interrupted to say I just helped housewives pick out curtains. The men laughed and clinked their glasses while I stared down at my plate, swallowing the truth that my company had just acquired a $50 million commercial plaza right down the street. I kept my mouth shut then because I loved him, but that love died on the frozen concrete of his mother's driveway. I opened my banking app and watched the pending transactions in real time. 3 rounds of expensive drinks appeared, then the appetizers. I could almost picture him sitting in a leather booth, leaning back and soaking up the admiration of men who only respected him for his wallet. I waited patiently, tapping my manicured nail against the marble countertop of my penthouse kitchen. The twins were still sleeping soundly, totally safe from the freezing temperatures their father had doomed us to just hours ago. I thought about Loretta and the smug satisfaction on her face when the door slammed shut. They had spent years chipping away at my identity. Loretta used to loudly complain at her church auxiliary meetings that Jamal had settled for a woman beneath his station. She would drag Chloe around, introducing her as the ideal daughter-in-law, simply because Chloe came from a wealthy white family and knew how to play the socialite game. Jamal never defended me. He let them tear me down because a broken wife was an obedient wife. Then the notification I had been waiting for finally hit my screen. A charge for $840 had been attempted at Prime Cut. Beside it, in bright red text, sat a single word: declined. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. My phone began to vibrate violently across the kitchen island. The caller ID flashed Jamal. I let it ring 4 times before sliding my finger across the screen to answer, putting him on speakerphone so his panic could fill the quiet room. "Kendra, what is going on with the accounts?" His voice was a frantic hiss, clearly trying to keep his volume down so his colleagues would not hear. "I am sitting here with my VP, and the waiter just told me my platinum card was rejected. Stop playing these petty little games and transfer your savings back into the joint checking right now." I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, listening to the absolute desperation dripping from every word he spoke. He actually believed he was entitled to my labor, to my compliance, to my silence. He demanded I transfer my savings, assuming I was just holding on to a few $1,000s from staging small suburban homes. The sheer audacity of his entitlement was suffocating. He had thrown me out without a second thought about how I would feed our premature babies, and yet his biggest emergency was saving face in front of his vice president. He was not asking about his newborn babies. He did not ask if Zion and Zuri survived the blizzard. His first and only concern was the humiliation of a declined credit card in front of other men. "I am not playing games, Jamal," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I am simply restructuring my financial portfolio. You locked your family out in a blizzard last night. Did you honestly think your funding would remain intact by morning?" "My funding?" He scoffed, a nervous laugh escaping his throat. "You mean my money. You have lost your mind. You think your little freelance design pennies are what keeps this family afloat. I am the one with the corporate salary. I demand you unfreeze that account immediately before I have to call my mother to wire me cash like some teenager." "Your mother cannot help you, Jamal," I replied, taking a slow sip of my water. "And neither can your corporate salary, because it barely covers the mortgage on that suburban museum your mother lives in. You never actually read the financial disclosure paperwork I gave you 2 years ago, did you? You just signed where I pointed because you were too busy bragging about a promotion." "What paperwork?" He snapped, the background noise of the steakhouse fading as he likely stepped into a hallway to yell at me. "The paperwork that established the corporate backing for your entire luxury lifestyle," I explained smoothly. "That joint account and those platinum cards were guaranteed by my business entity. You see, Kendra Lux Interiors is not a cute little hobby operating out of a spare bedroom. We do not just pick out throw pillows. We are a commercial staging and development firm. We develop luxury high-rises across the Midwest. I just withdrew my corporate assets from your personal accounts. Your credit limit is not frozen, Jamal. It is gone." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his shallow breathing as his brain struggled to process a reality that completely shattered his fragile worldview. He had spent years putting me down, treating me like a dependent burden, while he lived large on my silent subsidies. "You are lying." He finally choked out, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and terror. "You are a struggling designer. You begged me for a grocery allowance." "I allowed you to give me an allowance so you could feel like a man," I corrected him sharply. "I shrank myself to fit into your pathetic idea of a marriage because I wanted peace. But you burned that bridge the second you threw my babies into the snow to please your bitter mother. You wanted me to figure it out on my own nickel. Well, consider it figured out." "You vindictive, crazy woman," he roared, completely abandoning his hushed tone. "You think you can steal my money and take my kids? I will destroy you, Kendra. I will drag you through court and sue you for full custody of Zion and Zuri. You will not get a single dime of my paycheck, and I will make sure the judge knows you are mentally unstable." I smiled, staring at my reflection in the dark glass of the penthouse window. He was trying to use the very children he discarded as leverage. He still thought he had the upper hand. He still thought he was talking to the submissive girl from yesterday. "You can certainly attempt to sue for custody, Jamal," I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But you might want to ask your lawyer how family court views a man who abandons premature infants in sub-zero weather. Enjoy the rest of your lunch. I hear the tap water is free." I ended the call before he could scream another threat. I tossed the phone onto the marble island and took a deep breath. The first wave of retaliation was complete. He had no money, no credit, and no control. But cutting off his wallet was only the beginning. He and his mother still thought they had their social standing. They still thought they could paint me as the villain. I picked up my phone again and sent a quick message to my head of security at the main corporate building. I told him to expect visitors tomorrow. Jamal was arrogant and Loretta was greedy. They would not accept this defeat quietly. They would try to march into my old studio address expecting to intimidate a struggling artist in a cramped rental space. I pictured the look on their faces when they walked into a towering glass skyscraper instead. I brushed a gentle kiss over Zion's forehead and then over Zuri's. They were my only priority now. Jamal thought he could break me. Let him try. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my corporate office, highlighting the sleek modern lines of the custom mahogany desk I sat behind. My twins Zion and Zuri were fast asleep in the adjoining private nursery suite watched over by a highly vetted luxury nanny. I had a fresh cup of espresso resting on a coaster and a massive high-definition monitor angled perfectly in my line of sight. On that monitor, I was watching a live feed of the ground floor lobby of my building. I had warned my security team the night before to expect unwanted visitors, and precisely at 9 in the morning, the revolving doors spun to admit the 3 people I had been waiting to see. Jamal strutted into the grand lobby wearing his best tailored suit, projecting an air of absolute authority that he had not actually earned. Trailing right behind him was Loretta dressed in her Sunday best, clutching her designer handbag like a shield against the downtown crowds. Flanking them was a man in an ill-fitting gray suit, clutching a battered leather briefcase. Jamal had clearly scrambled to find the cheapest legal representation, willing to draft up aggressive asset seizure documents overnight. They marched up to the building directory, completely unaware that the address I had listed on my tax returns for years was not a cramped sublet, but a towering commercial high-rise. I tapped a button on my keyboard, bringing up the audio feed from the primary guest elevator, as the 3 of them stepped inside. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee, as Loretta's shrill voice filled my office. I cannot believe we have to come all the way down to this part of the city to claim half of her little arts and crafts project, Loretta complained loudly, adjusting her pearl necklace in the elevator mirror. I told the women at my church auxiliary board that she was running a scam out of a broom closet. A struggling freelancer, my foot. She probably has a few $1,000s stashed in a shoebox somewhere, and she thinks she can just run off with my grandbabies. We are taking every last penny she has hidden away, Jamal. Jamal puffed out his chest, nodding in agreement, while the cheap lawyer frantically flipped through his disorganized paperwork. "Do not worry, Mom," Jamal said, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "The law is strictly on my side here. She used marital funds to buy her little paint swatches and fabric samples. As her husband, I am legally entitled to 50% of whatever pathetic revenue she managed to scrape together. I am going to freeze her accounts, take the kids, and leave her with absolutely nothing. By noon, I will own her entire hobby." I smiled, setting my espresso down. For 3 years, I had sat at Loretta's dining room table listening to her brag to her affluent friends about how her son rescued a girl from a lower tax bracket. I had listened to her dismiss my ambition, framing my career as a cute distraction, while Jamal did the real work of providing. I had endured the subtle jabs, the patronizing advice, and the constant reminders that I was supposedly beneath them. They had built an entire reality around my financial inferiority. The elevator chimed, signaling their arrival at the top floor. I watched the security feed closely as the polished steel doors slid open. The smug expressions on their faces vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. They did not step out into a dingy hallway or a cramped shared co-working space. They stepped out onto a sprawling executive floor paved entirely in imported white marble. Massive glass walls offered breathtaking panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. Modern abstract art hung on the walls, illuminated by gallery-quality lighting. In the center of the vast space sat a curved reception desk carved from solid stone, behind which the illuminated silver letters of my company logo gleamed brightly. Kendra Luxe Interiors corporate headquarters. Loretta actually took a step backward, bumping into the cheap lawyer, who was now sweating profusely as he took in the sheer opulence of the space. Jamal blinked rapidly, his brain short-circuiting, as he tried to reconcile the sprawling multi-million-dollar corporate floor with the image of the broke, struggling wife he thought he had locked out in a blizzard. His denial kicked in almost immediately. He aggressively adjusted his tie and marched up to the front desk, assuming I was simply renting a tiny desk in the back of this massive corporation to make myself look important. "Excuse me," Jamal barked at the receptionist, slamming his hand down on the marble counter. "I am here to see Kendra. She is one of your freelance contractors. Tell her that her husband is here, and I am seizing her business assets. I have my attorney with me, and we are not leaving until she hands over her financial records." The receptionist did not flinch. She simply pressed a silent button under her desk. Before Jamal could launch into another arrogant demand, the heavy glass doors to the inner offices opened, and my head of security, David, stepped out. David was a towering, imposing man with decades of private security experience and zero tolerance for disrespect. He moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency, positioning himself directly between Jamal and the reception desk. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" David asked, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the marble walls. "I am Jamal, and I am looking for my wife, Kendra." Jamal demanded, pointing a finger at David. "She works out of this building. I am her husband, and I have the legal right to inspect her workspace and seize her business property. Now step aside and tell her to come out here before I have you fired." David looked down at Jamal with an expression of profound boredom. He did not move a single inch. "I am afraid you are severely mistaken about where you are standing," Sir David replied smoothly. "This entire floor is private corporate property, and you are currently trespassing." "I am not trespassing," Jamal yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of red as Loretta clutched his arm nervously. "I am the husband of the woman who rents space here. I have a legal right to her assets. I want to speak to the CEO of this company right now. Bring me whoever owns this floor because my wife owes me money." David clasped his hands in front of him, staring Jamal dead in the eye. "Sir, you do not have security clearance for the executive floor," David stated, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "And the CEO is currently busy running a multi-million-dollar firm. If you do not turn around and step back into that elevator, I will have you physically removed from the premises." Jamal scoffed, stepping closer to David in a pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. "You cannot remove me. I demand to know who the CEO of this building is." David offered a tight, cold smile. "The CEO of this building is the very woman you just demanded to see. Now step back." Exactly 10 days after Jamal locked me out in a freezing blizzard, his mother hosted her crown jewel event. The annual winter charity gala was Loretta's favorite excuse to gather the city elite and pretend her family sat at the absolute top of the social hierarchy. I knew Jamal would be there. After my security team marched him out of my corporate lobby with his tail between his legs, he had spent the entire week desperately trying to reclaim his narrative. He ignored my lawyer's calls and attended this gala to play the wounded, devoted father whose unhinged wife had completely lost her mind. I secured Zion and Zuri with their night nurse in my penthouse and dressed for war. I wore a custom emerald silk gown that draped perfectly, brushing the marble floors with every step. My locks were styled into a flawless, elegant updo that highlighted the diamond drop earrings sparkling against my dark skin. I did not look like the struggling freelance designer they had mocked for 3 years. I did not look like a desperate single mother begging for a handout. I looked like untouched generational wealth. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the historic Beaumont Hotel, a venue dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering white floral arrangements. The room hummed with the quiet chatter of wealthy donors, city politicians, and social climbers. I spotted my targets instantly near a massive ice sculpture in the center of the room. Loretta wore an outdated sequined dress, clutching a glass of wine and hanging tightly onto Jamal's arm. She was actively introducing him to the daughter of a prominent local judge, parading my husband around as an eligible, long-suffering bachelor who needed a good woman to heal his broken heart. Chloe stood just a few feet away, sipping expensive champagne and nodding along to every word Loretta said. Chloe was putting on a brilliant performance, masking the absolute panic she must have been feeling since receiving the eviction notice for her boutique. Instead of dealing with her crumbling business, she was clinging even harder to Loretta's coattails, desperate to secure her spot in the family hierarchy. They were all selling a beautiful, unified story of family resilience. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and walked directly into their line of sight. Loretta saw me first. Her fake, polished smile dropped so fast it was almost comical. Her eyes widened, taking in the emerald gown, the flawless makeup, and the quiet power radiating from my posture. Jamal turned, following his mother's gaze, and his jaw instantly clenched tight. He looked at me with a mixture of burning rage and deep confusion, still unable to comprehend the corporate giant I had revealed myself to be in that lobby days ago. Loretta immediately snapped her fingers, raising her hand to signal a pair of large security guards stationed near the ballroom entrance. She pointed a manicured finger directly at me, her voice cutting sharply through the smooth jazz playing in the background. "Guards," Loretta yelled, drawing the immediate attention of the wealthy donors and city officials standing around us. "Remove this woman from the premises immediately. She is a party crasher. She does not have a ticket to my gala, and she is not welcome here." The surrounding guests went completely silent, turning to watch the spectacle. Chloe stepped up right beside her mother-in-law, a vicious, eager smirk playing on her pale lips. She swirled her champagne, looking me up and down, with obvious disdain, trying to reassert the white savior dominance she had wielded over me for years. "Kendra, really?" Chloe laughed loudly, ensuring the judge's daughter and the other elite guests could hear every single word. "You cannot just show up to high society events uninvited and beg for Jamal to take you back. It is incredibly pathetic. Have some dignity and leave before they have to drag you out by your hair." Jamal crossed his arms, puffing out his chest. He stood tall, eager to watch me be publicly humiliated in front of the very crowd he desperately wanted to impress. He wanted me dragged out of the ballroom so he could play the victim card and earn the sympathy of every wealthy woman in the room. I did not move a single muscle. I did not break eye contact. I just smiled pleasantly at Chloe and took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The two security guards approached, looking hesitant, but following Loretta's aggressive pointing. They reached for their radios, ready to escort me out of the building. But before they could even step within 5 feet of me, a woman in a sharp black suit sprinted across the polished ballroom floor. It was Sylvia, the head event coordinator for the hotel. She was pale, sweating profusely, and practically hyperventilating as she shoved her way past the two large security guards. She nearly tripped over her own heels in her desperate rush to intercept them. Loretta crossed her arms, looking incredibly triumphant. "Thank you, Sylvia," Loretta said, her voice dripping with haughty satisfaction. "Please have this uninvited guest escorted to the service elevator so she does not disturb my donors any further." But Sylvia did not look at Loretta. She did not even acknowledge Jamal or the smirking Chloe standing beside him. The coordinator stopped directly in front of me, gasping for breath, and bowed her head slightly in a gesture of absolute submission. "I am so incredibly sorry, Miss Kendra," Sylvia stammered, her voice trembling with genuine terror. "We had no idea you would be attending in person tonight. I can have the entire VIP section cleared for you immediately. Please forgive this unacceptable intrusion." Loretta's jaw practically hit the floor. Her smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by sheer horror as the head coordinator of her crown jewel event bowed to the woman she had just called a party crasher. Sylvia was shaking. She kept her head bowed toward me, totally ignoring the furious woman standing to my left. Loretta's face turned an ugly shade of ash gray. She looked from Sylvia to me and back again, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Sylvia, have you lost your mind?" Loretta finally shrieked, no longer caring who heard her. She stepped forward, pointing a trembling manicured finger at my face. "This woman is my estranged daughter-in-law. She's a struggling freelancer who just drained my son's bank account. I demand you call the police and have her arrested for trespassing." Sylvia slowly stood up straight, her professional composure returning as she realized Loretta was entirely out of the loop. She looked at Loretta with a mixture of profound pity and absolute terror. "Ma'am," Sylvia said, her voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet of our immediate circle. Miss Kendra's commercial development firm acquired the Beaumont Property Group 6 weeks ago. She does not need a ticket to your charity gala. She owns the entire hotel. The silence that fell over our section of the ballroom was deafening. The judge's daughter, whom Loretta had been trying to set Jamal up with just moments prior, took a very deliberate step away from them. Chloe dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound slicing through the tension, but nobody even glanced in her direction. "That is a lie," Jamal barked, shoving his way past his mother to stand directly in front of me. His chest heaved, his tailored suit suddenly looking cheap and restrictive. "My wife stages houses in the suburbs. She buys fabric swatches. We share finances. I would absolutely know if she bought a historic downtown hotel." He reached out his hand, lunging aggressively toward my bare arm. Before his fingers could even brush my skin, a massive shadow stepped between us. David, my head of security, had materialized from the edge of the ballroom. He grabbed Jamal's wrist mid-air, his grip like a steel vise, and shoved his arm forcefully back down to his side. "Keep your hands to yourself, sir," David warned, his low, rumbling voice carrying a very clear threat of violence. Jamal stumbled backward, crashing into the ice sculpture display table. Water sloshed over the edges, soaking the cuffs of his trousers. "Jamal," I said, my voice smooth, even, and entirely unbothered. "You only knew what I allowed you to know. For 3 years, I sat at your mother's dining table while she bragged about securing this exact venue at a massive charitable discount because of her supposed elite social standing. She told her entire church auxiliary board that the Beaumont practically begged her to host this gala here." Loretta's eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing the wealthy donors she had spent decades trying to impress were listening to every single word. "The truth," I continued, taking a slow step toward her, "is that my corporate office approved your discounted contract. I subsidized this entire event behind your back because I was tired of hearing you complain about venue costs. I paid for your social status, Loretta. I bought the very floor you are standing on." Jamal shook his head wildly, his breathing shallow. "No, I own 20% of your assets. I signed the contract. My lawyer verified it. If you own this hotel, I own a piece of it. You own 20% of a defunct liability shell." I corrected him, my smile sharp and lethal. "But we can discuss your massive corporate debt at our next mediation. Tonight is about charity." I turned away from his panicked face and looked at Sylvia. The event coordinator was still standing at attention, awaiting my orders. "The VIP section will not be necessary, Sylvia," I told her warmly. "Please make sure my security detail is accommodated and ensure the waitstaff keeps the champagne flowing. I am simply here to welcome my guests." "Right away," Miss Kendra, Sylvia said, practically sprinting off to execute my commands. I turned my back on my husband and my mother-in-law. I did not give Chloe a single glance as I stepped over the shattered remains of her crystal glass. I glided through the ballroom, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown parting the sea of elite guests. Politicians, venture capitalists, and high society matriarchs automatically stepped aside, their eyes tracking my every movement. They could smell the shift in power. They recognized true authority, and it certainly did not belong to the woman hyperventilating by the melting ice sculpture. I walked directly to the grand stage at the front of the room. The jazz quartet, sensing the command in my posture, immediately ceased playing. The bandleader respectfully stepped back as I approached the microphone stand. I adjusted the height, the diamonds at my ears catching the spotlight. I looked out over the sprawling, opulent room. Hundreds of faces stared back at me. In the back near the entrance, I saw Jamal gripping his hair, arguing furiously with David, who refused to let him move an inch closer to the stage. And there was Loretta, her face a mask of absolute devastation, realizing her entire social empire was built on my charity. I tapped the microphone. A soft, clear, thumping sound echoed through the high ceilings, demanding absolute silence. "Good evening, Chicago," I said. My voice resonated through the state-of-the-art sound system, rich, warm, and dripping with undisputed power. "I want to personally welcome you all to the Beaumont. When my holding company finalized the acquisition of this historic property last month, I knew we needed to celebrate its grand reopening with a truly meaningful cause. A wave of impressed murmurs washed over the crowd. The wealthy elite loved nothing more than a powerful new player in their circle, and they were drinking in every word I said. I want to extend my deepest, most sincere gratitude. I continued flashing a brilliant camera-ready smile directly at the back of the room to my mother-in-law, Loretta. I am so incredibly proud of her for volunteering to organize this lovely little gathering right here in my building. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. The donors clapped enthusiastically, turning around to smile at Loretta, completely unaware of the lethal insult wrapped inside my gracious compliment. They thought we were a united, wealthy dynasty. They thought she was merely acting as an event planner for my massive corporate empire. I had just publicly demoted the queen of suburban high society to a volunteer party planner. Through the sea of clapping hands and flashing cameras, I watched the final remnants of Loretta's pride shatter into dust. Her knees physically buckled. She collapsed heavily into a velvet dining chair, clutching her chest as she gasped for air, completely ruined, in front of the only people whose opinions she ever cared about. The fallout from the Beaumont Gala was instantaneous. By 8 o'clock the next morning, my phone was vibrating right off the marble nightstand. Chloe was unraveling rapidly. Since I had silently terminated the commercial lease on her failing boutique the previous day, she was backed into a corner, and cornered animals always get sloppy. Instead of confronting me directly, she took to social media to launch a full-scale digital assault. I watched her live stream from the comfort of my heated bed, Zion and Zuri, sleeping peacefully in the next room. Chloe was sitting in her pristine suburban kitchen, wiping away non-existent tears with the sleeve of her designer cashmere cardigan. She spun an absolute masterclass in manipulation, playing the fragile, terrified victim to her thousands of followers. She did not mention my name, but the implication was crystal clear to anyone in our social circle. She told her audience that her beloved brother-in-law had been targeted by a deeply deceitful woman who spent years siphoning generational wealth from their family accounts. She stared directly into the camera, her voice trembling perfectly, as she claimed this unnamed woman embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars to fraudulently acquire commercial real estate. The comment section was a predictable cesspool of outrage, with her suburban country club friends rallying to her defense, calling me a criminal and demanding police intervention. Chloe was intentionally using her platform to paint me as the aggressive, greedy outsider who had dismantled their peaceful family. She desperately needed a scapegoat to explain her sudden loss of retail space before her friends realized she was actually broke. She weaponized her tears because that was the only currency she had left. I turned off the screen and handed my phone to my private assistant. I did not issue a public statement. I did not hire a public relations firm to draft a frantic denial. Arguing with a liar on the internet is a complete waste of capital. You do not fight a rumor with words, you kill it at the root. And the root of Chloe's entire fake empire was her husband, Trey. Trey was Jamal's older brother, and unlike Jamal, Trey actually worked for his success. He was a senior partner at a respected architecture firm. He was a decent, hardworking black man who simply had a fatal blind spot when it came to his wife. For years, Chloe had weaponized her fragile white woman tears against him whenever I was in the room. If I disagreed with her at a family barbecue, she would retreat to Trey, sobbing that I was intimidating her. If I wore a nicer dress to a holiday dinner, she would tell Trey I was flaunting my modest freelance money to make her feel bad about staying home. Trey always fell for the performance. He would pull me aside into the hallway and gently ask me to tone it down, to be the bigger person, and to accommodate her sensitivities because she was just so easily overwhelmed. He spent our entire family history playing the peacekeeper, completely blind to the fact that his wife was a parasite feeding off his hard-earned stability while constantly stepping on my neck. I actually respected Trey despite his blindness, which is exactly why I decided to give him a private execution instead of a public one. I sent him a single text message bypassing his wife entirely. I told him to come to my downtown penthouse address at noon, and to come alone. He arrived precisely on time. When the private elevator doors parted, Trey stepped out looking utterly exhausted. He was wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, loosening his tie, as his eyes swept over the massive glass-walled expanse of my living room. He looked out at the breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, and then down at the custom Italian furnishings. I could see the exact moment his brain short-circuited, trying to reconcile the struggling sister-in-law he thought he knew with the corporate titan whose floor he was currently standing on. He walked over to the massive marble kitchen island where I was waiting. He looked completely defeated, rubbing the back of his neck as he let out a heavy sigh. "Kendra," he started, his voice tight with stress. "I do not even know what to say anymore. Jamal is an absolute mess. My mother is having palpitations and calling her pastor, and Chloe is terrified. She is posting all this stuff online because she thinks you are coming after our house next. She thinks you stole money from Jamal to fund all of this." He gestured widely to the sprawling penthouse. "You have to understand where she is coming from, Kendra. She is just protecting our family. If Jamal says you drained his accounts and suddenly you own historic hotels and high-rises, you have to admit how bad it looks. Just talk to me. Help me fix this before Chloe goes to the authorities. She is just scared. She is a good person who is panicking because her boutique lease got canceled out of nowhere." I let him finish his desperate plea. He was still trying to be the peacekeeper, still trying to wrap Chloe's malicious lies in a blanket of good intentions. He truly believed he was married to an innocent victim who was just lashing out from fear. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or frustration. I simply reached for the heavy crystal decanter resting on the counter and poured a generous measure of top-shelf bourbon into a glass. I slid the amber liquid across the smooth marble surface until it stopped right in front of his hand. Then I reached under the counter. I bypassed the stack of business contracts and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. I looked Trey dead in the eyes, watching his desperate expression waver as I slid the folder across the marble island, letting it rest right next to his glass of bourbon. Trey stares at the leather-bound folder resting on the marble island. He looks at the amber liquid in his glass, then back up at me. His brow furrows. He reaches out and flips open the heavy cover. I do not say a word. I just watch his eyes track across the first page. It takes exactly 30 seconds for the confusion to curdle into sheer horror. "These are forensic accounting statements I hired my corporate team to pull." I explain, my voice smooth and clinical. "I own the commercial block where Chloe leased her boutique. When I terminated her month-to-month contract, I had my legal team audit the tenant financial history to ensure we were not liable for any of her outstanding vendor debts. What they found was a massive trail of redirected funds." Trey blinks rapidly, flipping to the second page and then the third. His hands begin to tremble. "Chloe has not been running a successful lifestyle brand. Trey," I continue, leaning against the counter, "she has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years. Nobody is buying $100 imported candles and oversized beige linen shirts. She has zero retail profit. So to keep up her image as the wealthy, successful entrepreneur, she started siphoning capital directly from your private investment accounts." "That is impossible," Trey stammers, his voice cracking. He taps a shaking finger against a highlighted column of numbers. "Chloe handles our joint finances, but my private portfolio is handled by a broker. She told me the tech sector took a massive hit last quarter. She said market dips wiped out my yearly bonus." I tapped the exact same line on the paper. "There was no market dip, Trey. She forged your signature to authorize wire transfers into a dummy LLC she set up under her maiden name. She then funneled those exact amounts into her boutique to cover rent inventory and those lavish launch parties she threw for her country club friends. She stole your bonuses. She drained your stock options. She literally bankrupted your future to buy her seat right next to Loretta at the Sunday dinner table." Trey grips the edge of the marble island. His knuckles turned stark white. For years, Chloe had played the ultimate white savior in our African-American family. She smiled her condescending smile at me, offering unsolicited advice about my freelance budget, while she was secretly bleeding a black man dry to fund her fake elitist aesthetic. Trey had defended her every single time. He had asked me to be the bigger person when she insulted my hair or my clothes. He had protected a parasite because she knew exactly how to weaponize her fragile tears. Look at the dates, Trey, I urge quietly. Look at the $50,000 withdrawal from last November. That was the exact same week she stood in Loretta's kitchen and lectured me about how Jamal and I needed to be more fiscally responsible. She bought a brand new Porsche 2 days later. Trey stops flipping the pages. He stares at a highlighted wire transfer that drained his retirement savings. The color completely drains from his face. He picks up the glass of top-shelf bourbon and downs it in one single, agonizing swallow. The glass hits the marble with a sharp clink. He does not yell. He does not throw anything. The betrayal is so absolute it simply breaks him. Trey closes the folder. He pulls it tightly against his chest like a shield. He looks at me, and for the first time in the history of our family dynamic, he does not ask me to accommodate his wife. He just nods, his jaw set so hard it looks like it might snap. He turns around and walks straight into the private elevator. The doors slide shut on a man who is about to burn his own house down to the foundation. I rinse his glass in the sink and dry my hands. I know exactly what will happen next. Chloe is a cornered rat. When Trey confronts her with undeniable forensic proof of her financial crimes, she will not confess. She will immediately run to the only people foolish enough to protect her. It takes less than 4 hours for my phone to ring. The caller ID flashes Jamal. The moment I answer, his voice explodes through the speaker, raw and vibrating with absolute fury. "You are a sick, jealous monster," Kendra, Jamal roars, not even pausing to take a breath. "You could not handle the fact that Chloe actually built something beautiful, so you had to forge a bunch of fake bank statements to destroy my brother's marriage. Chloe is sitting in my mother's kitchen right now, having a panic attack, because Trey kicked her out. You fabricated federal documents just to hurt our family." I smile, leaning back against the plush sofa in my living room. Jamal is entirely predictable. Faced with documented proof of his sister-in-law committing grand larceny, he instantly decides the successful black woman must be a criminal forging documents to ruin the fragile, crying white woman. His internalized bias and his desperate need to defeat me make him the perfect puppet. "The documents are verified by a certified forensic accountant," Jamal, I reply calmly. "Your brother can verify the missing funds with his own bank whenever he wants. Chloe is a thief." "She is a victim," Jamal shouts over me. "She is a victim of your psychotic vendetta. You are unhinged, Kendra. You have completely lost your mind since I kicked you out. You are making up this massive corporate empire. You are making up these embezzlement claims. You are just a bitter, broke designer who cannot handle reality." He pauses, his breathing heavy through the receiver. I can hear Loretta in the background comforting a sobbing Chloe. Jamal thinks he has me cornered. He thinks his volume equals power. "I am done playing nice with a crazy woman." Jamal spits out, his voice dripping with venom. "My lawyer is filing the papers tomorrow morning. I am taking you to divorce mediation. I am going to demand 50% of whatever pathetic assets you actually have, and I am going to demand permanent alimony since I clearly supported your delusional hobby for 3 years. And thanks to these fake documents you just handed to Trey, I am going to prove to a family court judge that you are mentally unfit to raise Zion and Zuri. I am taking full custody." A thrill of pure icy satisfaction shoots straight down my spine. This is exactly what I wanted. He is so blinded by his arrogance and his desperate need to protect his mother's favorite daughter-in-law that he is charging headfirst into a legal battlefield without checking his weapons. He thinks he is laying a trap for a helpless woman. He has no idea he just handed me the keys to his absolute destruction. "I look forward to it, Jamal," I say, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "Have your lawyer set the date. I will see you in mediation." I hang up the phone before he can say another word. I walk over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The financial freeze was just the opening act. Exposing Chloe was just clearing the board. Now the real war begins. Jamal wants to walk into a legal room and demand half of an empire he mocked for years. He is about to learn that when you demand half of my kingdom, you also inherit the guillotine. The heavy oak doors of the mediation room closed with a solid thud, sealing us inside. I sat at the long mahogany table wearing a tailored white suit that projected absolute calm. Beside me sat my attorney Xavier. He was a ruthless, brilliant black man who did not speak unless he was delivering a death blow. Across from us, the door opened again. Jamal strutted into the room like he was walking a red carpet. He wore a brand new navy suit, likely purchased on a high-interest credit card, since I had vaporized his platinum accounts. He was flanked by a frantic-looking lawyer clutching a thick briefcase. Jamal smirked at me, completely confident that he was about to put his rebellious wife back in her place. He pulled out his chair and sat down, crossing his legs and leaning back with an arrogance that made my stomach turn. He genuinely believed that exposing his sister-in-law's embezzlement was just a lucky strike on my part. He thought my corporate assets were an exaggerated bluff. He still viewed me as the woman who used to ask him for grocery money. "Let us get right to the point," Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not even wait for the mediator to speak. "My lawyer has prepared a very generous settlement offer, Kendra. You sign over 50% of your little staging company and the properties you supposedly own. I am also seeking full custody of Zion and Zuri. You have clearly proven yourself to be mentally unstable and deceitful, hiding assets from your own husband. Plus, I will be requiring permanent alimony. I financially supported your little design hobby for 3 years while you played around with throw pillows. I built your foundation, so I own half the house." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head and looked at Xavier. Xavier adjusted his gold cufflinks and opened his sleek leather portfolio. He did not look at Jamal. He looked directly at Jamal's lawyer. "Counselor Xavier," began, his voice dangerously quiet, "I strongly suggest you advise your client to remain silent before he further incriminates himself on the record. We are not here to negotiate a generous settlement. We are here to dictate the terms of your client's absolute surrender." Jamal scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You are bluffing. Both of you. I am the primary provider. I have the corporate job. No judge is going to give her everything just because she rented a fancy office and printed some fake bank statements about my brother." Xavier pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the polished wood. It was not a financial document. It was the police report from the night of the blizzard. Right behind it, Xavier placed the pediatric wellness check signed by the emergency physician. "My client is filing for sole physical and sole legal custody of the children," Xavier stated cleanly, cutting through Jamal's arrogant laughter. "10 days ago, your client intentionally locked a mother and 2 premature infants outdoors during a severe winter storm advisory. We have the security camera footage from the neighbor's house across the street. We have the police dispatch logs. We have the medical evaluations proving the infants suffered dangerous exposure to freezing temperatures." Jamal shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering slightly, but he quickly puffed his chest out again. "That was a simple misunderstanding. She forgot her keys. My mother can testify to that." "Your mother is a co-conspirator to child endangerment," Xavier replied without missing a beat. "If you attempt to fight this custody arrangement, we will bypass family court entirely and press criminal charges for reckless endangerment of a minor against both you and your mother. You will receive supervised, monitored visitation for 2 hours every other weekend. You will pay for the court-appointed monitor." Jamal slammed his hand on the table, his composure cracking. "You cannot take my kids away from me. I am their father. You are a sperm donor who weaponized the weather against your own blood," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was smooth and utterly devoid of pity. "You do not get to claim fatherhood only when it is financially convenient for you, Jamal." Xavier pulled out a second stack of documents. "As for the alimony and division of assets, my client owes you absolutely nothing. You did not support her business. The financial disclosures we filed this morning prove that Kendra Lux Interiors has been fully self-funded and highly profitable for over 4 years. In fact, the forensic accounting demonstrates that my client was quietly subsidizing your entire luxury lifestyle. Your credit cards, your car lease, and your country club membership were all guaranteed by her corporate entity. You are not a provider, Jamal. You are a dependent. You are entitled to 0 alimony." The mediator reviewed the documents, her eyes widening as she verified the staggering financial disparity between Jamal's modest corporate salary and my massive commercial holding company. Jamal's lawyer swallowed hard, clearly realizing he had marched into a legal slaughterhouse entirely unprepared. But Jamal did not panic. The fear I expected to see in his eyes did not materialize. Instead, his lips curled into a vicious, triumphant grin. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with pure, unadulterated malice. "You always thought you were the smartest person in the room," Kendra Jamal sneered. "You think you can just hide a multi-million-dollar real estate empire from your husband and walk away clean? You think you can just cut off my credit cards and laugh in my face? But you forgot one very important detail." He snapped his fingers at his lawyer. The lawyer, looking slightly nervous, unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder. He slid a perfectly preserved legal document across the table toward Xavier. I glanced down at the paper. It carried the official letterhead of my original business incorporation. It was dated exactly 1 year ago. At the bottom of the page, sitting right above the notary seal, was my unmistakable signature next to Jamal's. "Read it out loud," Counselor Jamal commanded, leaning back in his chair like a king claiming his throne. His lawyer cleared his throat. "This is a binding equity transfer agreement executed 12 months ago. It explicitly states that Kendra transfers 20% of all corporate equity holdings and active business assets to her husband Jamal. The contract is fully notarized and legally binding." Jamal laughed, a sharp, booming sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "You played yourself, Kendra. You tried to hoard all your little secret millions, but you willingly signed over a fifth of your entire empire to me last year when you needed my signature for that tax filing. I do not need your alimony. I do not need your pity. I own 20% of every single high-rise, every hotel, and every piece of commercial dirt you just bragged about. I am a multimillionaire, and you cannot do a single thing to stop me." Jamal looked at me, waiting for the devastation to hit my face. He waited for the tears, for the desperate pleading, for the realization that my own husband had legally outmaneuvered me and secured a massive piece of my generational wealth. He grinned, his eyes shining with greedy satisfaction, completely convinced he had just won the ultimate lottery. Jamal leaned back in his chair, waiting for the devastation to hit my face. He expected me to break down right there at the mediation table. He expected me to beg him to spare my companies. Instead, Xavier quietly closed his leather portfolio. My attorney did not argue. He did not object. He simply looked at the mediator and requested that the session be suspended, pending a formal sworn deposition to review the corporate contract. Jamal laughed out loud, totally convinced my silence was an admission of absolute defeat. I stood up, smoothed the lines of my white suit, and walked out of the room with Xavier right beside me. When we stepped into the plush reception area of the mediation center, Loretta was already waiting. Jamal burst through the doors behind us, holding the copied contract high in the air like a championship trophy. Loretta actually shrieked with joy. She dug into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a miniature bottle of champagne, popping the cork right there in the waiting room. She poured the foaming liquid into a plastic water cup and handed it to her son. "God always blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked," Loretta announced, her voice booming across the quiet reception area so everyone could hear. She glared at me with pure, venomous triumph. "I told you, Jamal. I told you we would take everything she tried to hide from us. You are a multi-millionaire now, baby." Jamal took a sip of the champagne, wrapping his free arm around his mother's shoulders. He looked at me with absolute contempt. "You can send the corporate financial records directly to my lawyer, Kendra," he demanded. "I expect my first shareholder dividend check by the end of the week." I did not respond. I just let my heels click rhythmically against the hardwood floor as Xavier and I walked straight to the private elevator, leaving them to celebrate their glorious imaginary victory. They needed that victory desperately. Behind that arrogant champagne toast, Jamal was drowning. I had completely revoked his access to my corporate credit lines, leaving him with a mountain of personal bills he could not afford. The bank was just days away from foreclosing on Loretta's pristine suburban mansion. To make matters worse, Chloe was blowing up his phone every hour, sobbing that Trey had frozen her out of all their accounts and kicked her out of the house. Jamal was desperate to play the wealthy savior. He needed to prove he was the powerful provider who could bail his mother and his sister-in-law out of ruin. But traditional banks do not grant massive loans based on a contested divorce contract. So Jamal did exactly what greedy, desperate finance men do. He took his notarized equity agreement straight to a predatory private equity firm in downtown Chicago. He sat across from a hard money lender and used his 20% stake in my corporate empire as collateral. Because the perceived value of Kendra Luxe Interiors was so astronomically high, the private lender approved an immediate cash bridging loan for $2 million at an exorbitant interest rate. Jamal was completely convinced he would easily pay off the loan the second a family court judge forced me to liquidate my assets for his divorce settlement. He took the cash. He paid the overdue mortgage on Loretta's mansion, and he handed Chloe a massive check to secure a luxury apartment and hire a high-priced defense attorney for her impending embezzlement trial. I knew every single move he made. My wealth manager, Malik, tracked the lien inquiry the moment the private lender ran the corporate background check. Malik called me asking if we should block the inquiry. I told him to give them the green light. I waited patiently in my penthouse sipping espresso while the $2 million loan cleared Jamal's bank account. I let him spend the money. I let him sign the predatory loan agreement. I let him dig his own financial grave. 5 days later, we met for the formal sworn deposition. The atmosphere in the sterile conference room was thick with tension. A certified court reporter sat at the end of the table, her fingers hovering over her steno machine. Jamal swaggered into the room, wearing a brand-new custom-tailored suit, clearly purchased with his freshly acquired loan money. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and sat down across from me, flashing a smug, arrogant smile. He thought he was walking into my surrender. Xavier opened his portfolio. He methodically guided Jamal through the standard deposition questions. Jamal swore under oath to tell the complete truth. Xavier placed the equity transfer contract on the table. "Is this your signature, Jamal?" he asked, his voice calm and clinical. "Yes, it is," Jamal answered proudly, leaning back in his chair. "That is the contract where Kendra transferred 20% of her entire corporate equity to me. And you fully understood the terms of this contract when you signed it," Xavier pressed. "You accepted the 20% equity and all the responsibilities tied to that specific corporate entity." Jamal scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Of course I did. I am a corporate finance manager. I know how equity transfers work. I am the legal owner of 20% of her company." Xavier nodded slowly. He pulled a second document from his portfolio. "And did you recently use this exact equity contract to secure a $2 million bridging loan from a private lender?" Jamal's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but Jamal just smirked. "Yes, I did. My assets are highly valuable. I leveraged my corporate equity to secure liquid capital. It is standard business practice." "Thank you for confirming that on the record," Xavier said. He reached into his portfolio one last time and pulled out a certified corporate registry document, pulling the official state seal. He slid it across the table, stopping right in front of Jamal. "I suggest you read the specific name of the limited liability company listed on your equity contract." Jamal Xavier instructed, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You did not sign for 20% of Kendra Luxe Interiors. You did not sign for 20% of her parent holding company." Jamal frowned, leaning forward to read the document. His smug smile began to falter. The color slowly drained from his face as his eyes tracked across the bold black text. "That contract is for a defunct, isolated shell company I created 4 years ago," I said, breaking my silence. The words hit the room like falling concrete. "It is an entity called KL Holdings. It has 0 active assets. It owns 0 real estate. What it does have, however, is over $500,000 in toxic, unrecoverable debt from a severely botched vendor dispute." Jamal's breathing hitched. His eyes darted frantically from the paper to his lawyer and back to me. "You did not claim my wealth, Jamal," I continued, leaning forward and looking directly into his terrified eyes. "By signing that contract and swearing under oath that you fully accepted the terms, you legally claimed 20% of a massive toxic debt." And by using that worthless shell company to fraudulently secure a $2 million cash loan from a predatory lender, you just committed federal bank fraud. You are not a multimillionaire, Jamal. You are completely bankrupt, and you are going to prison. The air in the sterile conference room felt heavy, but I was breathing easier than I had in years. The court reporter sat at the edge of the long table, her fingers hovering silently over her steno machine, waiting for the next exchange. Jamal was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction in his custom-tailored suit, a suit I knew for a fact he had bought with the predatory loan money he secured just days ago. He crossed his arms and looked at me as if he had just checkmated a grandmaster. Xavier did not flinch. My attorney simply adjusted his glasses and retrieved a single crisp sheet of paper from his leather portfolio. He did not hand it to Jamal. He slid it directly to Jamal's attorney, a man who was already sweating through his cheap collar. Counselor Xavier said, his voice a low and steady rumble. I direct your attention to page 2, section 4, paragraph B of the equity transfer agreement your client just proudly admitted to signing. Please read the exact legal name of the entity my client transferred equity from. Jamal's lawyer adjusted his reading glasses. He scanned the page. His eyes darted back to the top of the paragraph, and he read it again. The color began to drain from his face, rapidly, replaced by a sickly pale gray. He looked at Jamal, and then back at the paper, his hands starting to tremble. Read it, Counselor Xavier commanded the authority in his tone, leaving no room for hesitation. The lawyer cleared his throat, and his voice cracked. It says KL Holdings Limited Liability Company. Jamal rolled his eyes and let out an exasperated sigh. So what, he snapped, leaning forward. KL Holdings. Kendra Lux Interiors. It is all the same money. She uses different names for tax purposes. I know how corporate structures work. I still own 20% of her real estate empire. You really do not know how corporate structures work, Jamal, I said, breaking my silence. My voice was smooth, completely devoid of the panic he was so desperately waiting to see. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany table, and looked him dead in the eyes. KL Holdings is not a parent company. It is not a subsidiary attached to my commercial staging revenues. It is a completely isolated, defunct shell entity I created over 4 years ago. Jamal's confident smirk twitched, but he forced a laugh. Nice try, Kendra. You cannot hide your assets from me. I saw the bank statements. Those bank statements belong to Kendra Lux Enterprises. I corrected him softly. KL Holdings has 0 active assets. It owns 0 commercial real estate. It generates absolutely 0 revenue. What it does have, however, is a massive amount of toxic, unrecoverable debt. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the quiet tapping of the court reporter's keys, capturing every single word of Jamal's impending destruction. 4 years ago, I continued making sure to enunciate every syllable so he could not misunderstand his reality. I contracted with a luxury materials vendor, who turned out to be running a massive supply chain scam. When the deal went south, it left my preliminary business with over $500,000 in toxic debt. I did exactly what any smart developer does. I isolated that liability into a standalone shell company to protect my primary assets. I quarantined the poison. Jamal's breathing hitched. His eyes darted from me to Xavier and then to his own lawyer, who was now actively pushing his chair slightly away from his client. When you demanded a piece of my company last year to stroke your ego, I explained. Watching the realization slowly dawn on his face, you did not read the fine print. You were so eager to play the big-shot investor, so desperate to feel like you owned my success, that you signed the very first document I put in front of you. By signing that equity transfer agreement and swearing under oath today that you fully accepted its terms, you did not claim my wealth. You legally claimed 20% of a $500,000 black hole. That is a lie, Jamal shouted, slamming his hand flat on the table. You are lying. You cannot do that. That is fraud. It is a legally binding contract that you just bragged about signing, Xavier interjected smoothly. You assumed liability for that corporate debt. But the debt is actually the least of your problems right now, Jamal. Xavier leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. You testified on the record under oath just 10 minutes ago that you leveraged this specific equity contract to secure a $2 million cash bridging loan from a private equity lender. You used KL Holdings as your primary collateral. Jamal's chest was heaving. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take over. When you apply for a multi-million-dollar commercial loan, Xavier continued, you are required to sign a declaration of asset valuation. You told a financial institution that your 20% stake was backed by a highly profitable commercial real estate firm. You used their money to pay off a residential foreclosure and fund a luxury lifestyle. Securing a loan by intentionally misrepresenting the value of the underlying collateral is not a civil dispute, Jamal. It is a federal crime. It is called bank fraud. The cheap lawyer sitting next to Jamal suddenly stood up, grabbing his briefcase with shaking hands. I need to consult with my client in private, he stammered, the sweat now visibly rolling down his forehead. We need to suspend this deposition. It is too late for that, Counselor, Xavier said, checking his gold watch. The deposition is already on the record, and my office has already fulfilled our legal obligation to notify the private lender that their collateral is entirely insolvent. I imagine they are currently contacting the federal authorities regarding the wire fraud your client just committed. Jamal sat completely frozen. The custom-tailored suit he was wearing suddenly looked like a prison uniform. The $2 million he thought was his ultimate victory was actually a federal trap that he had happily locked himself inside. He had used that money to pay off the mortgage on Loretta's precious suburban mansion. He had handed a massive check to Chloe to pay for her criminal defense lawyer. He had spent money that belonged to ruthless private investors who did not care about family drama or suburban social status. They only cared about their money, and Jamal had just stolen $2 million from them using a worthless piece of paper. You set me up, Jamal whispered, his voice cracking. He sounded like a terrified little boy, stripped of all his arrogant bluster. You planned this. You let me take that loan. I did not make you arrogant, Jamal, I said, standing up from the table. I did not make you greedy. You wanted to take half of everything I built because you thought I was beneath you. You thought you could throw my newborn babies into a blizzard and then waltz into a mediation room to steal my empire. I did not set you up. I just let you operate under the delusion of your own superiority. I picked up my designer handbag and looked down at the man who had tormented me for 3 years. He was trembling violently, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it almost looked like physical pain. He was completely bankrupt. He was facing federal prison time, and the very people he had tried to save, Loretta and Chloe, were about to be dragged right down into the abyss with him. Enjoy your 20%, I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the quiet room. I hear the private equity collectors are significantly less forgiving than family court judges. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room, the heavy wooden door closing with a definitive click behind me. The hallway was bright and quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation I had just left behind. I had not just defeated my husband, I had financially and legally obliterated him. But the avalanche was only just beginning to fall, and I was more than ready to watch the rest of his family get buried underneath the snow. The morning after the deposition, the air in my penthouse felt incredibly light. I sat at my marble kitchen island, feeding Zion his morning bottle, while Zuri slept soundly against my chest in her carrier. My phone sat quietly on the counter, but I knew the absolute chaos that was currently erupting across the city. Jamal had walked into that mediation room, convinced he was a corporate mastermind. He walked out as a target for federal investigators and ruthless private equity collectors. Xavier called me precisely at 9 o'clock. His voice carried that familiar smooth satisfaction of a lawyer watching a trap snap shut flawlessly. He informed me that Sterling Capital, the aggressive private lending firm Jamal had used to secure his $2 million cash loan, had initiated their mandatory post-funding audit. Private lenders do not operate like traditional banks. They do not wait months to verify their collateral. When they loan out millions in bridging capital, they tear into the corporate structures immediately. It took Sterling Capital exactly 14 hours to realize they had been played. Their forensic accountants pulled the tax identification numbers for KL Holdings, the entity Jamal proudly claimed he owned 20% of. They did not find a thriving commercial staging empire. They found a digital graveyard. They found a defunct isolated shell company carrying $500,000 in unrecoverable toxic debt from a vendor dispute I settled years ago. Jamal had sworn under penalty of perjury and signed federal lending documents stating his equity was tied to my highly profitable primary holding company. Xavier told me the fallout was instantaneous and merciless. Sterling Capital did not send a polite warning letter. They invoked the acceleration clause buried in the fine print of Jamal's loan agreement. They demanded the immediate return of the $2 million in full payable within 24 hours. I smiled, brushing a kiss over Zion's warm forehead. Jamal did not have $2 million. He did not even have $2,000. He had spent the loan money the very second it hit his bank account, desperately trying to play the wealthy savior for his mother and his sister-in-law. He paid off the impending foreclosure on Loretta's massive suburban estate. He wrote a massive check to secure a high-priced defense attorney for Chloe to fight her embezzlement charges. He blew the rest on the custom-tailored suits he wore to his deposition. The money was completely gone. By noon, my phone began to display a rapid succession of rejected calls from Jamal. He was blocked from ringing through, but the voicemails piled up one after another. I listened to them while pacing the floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room. His first message was furious, demanding I call the lender and explain it was a simple clerical error. He ordered me to transfer my actual corporate assets to his name to cover the gap. By the fourth voicemail, the arrogant demands had dissolved into sheer, unadulterated panic. His voice cracked as he begged me to wire him cash, claiming the lender's attorneys were threatening to contact the FBI regarding wire fraud and bank fraud. I deleted every single message without responding. He wanted to be a powerful provider so desperately. Now he had to provide answers to federal authorities. The destruction escalated exponentially by the afternoon. Sterling Capital was not going to simply absorb a $2 million loss. When they realized Jamal was completely insolvent, their legal team executed a sweeping asset freeze. Because Jamal had used the fraudulently obtained loan funds to pay off the mortgage arrears on Loretta's house, the private lender immediately targeted the property. They filed an emergency injunction demonstrating that the suburban mansion had been rescued using stolen capital. The court agreed with terrifying speed. The bank that held Loretta's original mortgage was notified of the fraudulent activity. They immediately reversed the payments Jamal had made, reinstating the total default status of the property. But it did not stop there. Because the house was now tied to a federal wire fraud investigation, the bank accelerated the foreclosure process to protect their own liabilities. Loretta had spent decades building an illusion of untouchable generational wealth. She treated her sprawling brick estate as a royal court where she judged everyone else's worth. She hosted her elite church auxiliary board meetings there, sipping sweet tea and gossiping about women who could not afford her lifestyle. She had specifically mocked my modest upbringing, standing in her grand foyer, treating me like a peasant allowed indoors by the grace of her son. Her entire identity was tied to that specific address. And now, because of her son's profound greed and arrogance, it was being violently ripped away. Xavier sent me a copy of the official seizure notice that was served to the property. It was not a quiet, discreet mailing. The bank sent county sheriffs to physically post the bright orange foreclosure and seizure notice directly on Loretta's custom mahogany front door. The timing could not have been more poetic. Loretta had scheduled a lavish afternoon luncheon for the ladies of her social club. She had planned to brag about Jamal's massive new financial settlement and parade her supposed wealth. Instead, her wealthy society friends pulled their luxury sedans into her circular driveway, only to find two armed sheriffs standing on the porch, taping a brightly colored eviction notice over her decorative seasonal wreath. The humiliation was absolute. In the tight-knit, affluent African-American social circles of Chicago suburbs, news travels faster than a wildfire. By dinner time, every single member of Loretta's church, every woman in her social club, and every neighbor on her pristine cul-de-sac knew that the family was completely bankrupt. The facade was shattered. They were not a wealthy dynasty. They were frauds, drowning in debt, and facing federal investigations. Chloe, the sister-in-law who had tried to destroy me online to save her own skin, caught the collateral damage immediately. The high-powered defense attorney Jamal had hired for her received notice that his retainer was paid with fraudulently obtained funds. The law firm dropped Chloe as a client, instantly refusing to be associated with wire fraud. Without Jamal's stolen money, Chloe was left completely defenseless against Trey's impending embezzlement lawsuit. Her social media accounts went dead silent. The white savior who loved to look down on me was now broke abandoned by her legal counsel and facing prison time for stealing from a black man. I sat in my home office reviewing the legal updates as the sun set over the city. I felt a profound sense of peace. For 3 years I had shrunk myself to make them comfortable. I had accepted their insults and their financial abuse because I believed family required sacrifice. But they were never my family. They were parasites feeding off my labor while punishing me for my existence. They thought throwing me into a blizzard would break my spirit. They did not understand that the cold only made me sharper. The next morning, the final stage of their residential ruin commenced. The bank was not giving Loretta 30 days to casually pack her belongings and secure a new luxury rental. Due to the fraudulent nature of the funds used to manipulate the mortgage, the eviction timeline was brutally expedited. They were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before the locks would be changed and the property seized for public auction. I dressed in a sleek black turtleneck and tailored trousers. I arranged for my private driver to take me to the suburbs. I did not go to confront them or scream or cause a scene. I went simply to observe the natural consequences of their own malicious actions. When my SUV pulled to a stop at the end of their street, the scene unfolding was a masterpiece of poetic justice. 2 massive, incredibly cheap moving trucks were parked haphazardly on the pristine lawn, tearing up the expensive landscaping Loretta obsessed over. There were no professional white-glove movers carefully wrapping fine art. Jamal and Loretta were dragging heavy cardboard boxes out of the front door by themselves, sweating and straining under the weight. Jamal looked entirely defeated. He had lost his corporate finance job 2 days ago when Human Resources caught wind of the federal bank fraud investigation surrounding his private equity loan. No financial institution would employ a man actively being pursued for millions in fraudulent debt. He was wearing an old, stained sweatshirt struggling to lift a heavy television stand. Loretta was a shadow of the haughty matriarch she had been just weeks prior. Her hair was unstyled, her face devoid of makeup. She was frantically shoving designer clothes into black plastic trash bags because they clearly could not afford enough moving boxes. She kept looking around nervously, terrified of who might be watching. And people were definitely watching. The neighbors, the same wealthy doctors and lawyers Loretta had desperately tried to impress for years, were standing at the edges of their manicured lawns. Some were pretending to check their mail, while others were openly sipping coffee from their travel mugs, watching the mighty fall. The whispering was palpable. The neighborhood elite were bearing witness to the absolute destruction of Loretta's carefully curated empire. I watched Jamal drop a heavy box of kitchenware onto the driveway. The cardboard split open, sending expensive plates crashing onto the exact same icy concrete where he had tossed my diaper bag. He knelt down, surrounded by shattered porcelain, clutching his head in his hands. He had traded a loyal wife and 2 beautiful children for his mother's approval and his own toxic pride. Now he had absolutely nothing. The private lender was still coming for him. The federal investigators were building their case. The toxic $500,000 debt from my shell company was permanently attached to his name, garnishing whatever minimum wage income he might eventually secure. He was staring down the barrel of total financial and legal annihilation. My driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions. I did not ask him to roll down the window. I did not feel the need to shout a triumphant parting word. Seeing them pack their entire lives into garbage bags under the judging eyes of the neighborhood they worshipped was entirely sufficient. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, wrapping my coat around myself. The blizzard was over and the spring thaw was coming. I tapped the glass separating me from the driver and gave a simple nod. "Take us back downtown," I said, my voice steady and clear. "It is time to go home." The SUV glided smoothly away from the curb, leaving Jamal and Loretta in the rearview mirror, surrounded by shattered plates and cardboard boxes. They had thrown me to the wolves, assuming I would be devoured. They failed to realize I was the one who trained them. The suburban house faded from view, replaced by the towering steel and glass of the city skyline where my children were waiting safely in an empire built on my own unshakable foundation. I returned to my downtown penthouse feeling a profound sense of absolute tranquility. The storm that had raged in my life for 3 years was completely silenced by the sound of my own success. I poured a cup of herbal tea and walked into my home office. Zion and Zuri were napping under the watchful eye of their luxury nanny. I opened my laptop to review the latest quarterly reports for my commercial development projects. I was completely focused on a new high-rise acquisition when my private cell phone began to vibrate violently across the polished mahogany desk. This was not my public business line. This was the encrypted private number I only gave to my wealth manager Malik, my attorney Xavier, and my head of security. The caller identification screen flashed an unknown local number. I knew exactly who it was. Jamal had given his mother my private contact information because he was too much of a coward to make the call himself. I watched the phone vibrate for a few seconds. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth. Then I swiped the screen and answered, putting the call on speakerphone. "Kendra, please, you have to help us," Loretta screamed into the receiver. She was sobbing so hysterically that her words were barely coherent. Her voice was completely stripped of that haughty, elite tone she used to command the Sunday dinner table. She sounded like a drowning woman, gasping for a single breath of air. The wind whipped in the background of her call. She was standing outside on the sidewalk. "Kendra, are you there? Please tell me you are listening. You cannot let them do this to us." I did not reply immediately. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to sit in the uncomfortable reality that I held absolute power over the conversation. "Yes, Loretta, I am here," I finally said, my voice smooth and perfectly level. "I assume the bank finalized their asset seizure this afternoon." "It is an absolute nightmare," Loretta wailed. She blew her nose loudly into the receiver. "The sheriffs just locked the front doors. They taped a bright yellow seizure notice right over my custom mahogany entryway. They forced me to leave half of my antique furniture inside. Jamal is sitting on a garbage bag full of his clothes on the curb. Kendra, they threw us out into the street. We are completely homeless. You have to stop this. You have to call your lawyers and make this go away. We are family, Kendra. You cannot let the grandmother of your children sit on a concrete sidewalk." The audacity was so breathtaking it almost made me laugh. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers together. "Family," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue like poison. "That is a fascinating word for you to use today, Loretta. 10 days ago, when you stood on your warm porch in your silk robe and watched your son throw my 10-day-old premature twins into a blinding blizzard, you specifically told me I was not family. You told me I was a gold-digging fraud and a charity case. You told me to find a shelter. Did your definition of family suddenly change the exact moment your bank account hit zero?" That was Jamal. Loretta cried out instantly, throwing her favorite son directly under the bus to save her own skin. "I tried to stop him, Kendra. I begged him to let you stay, but he was so angry and out of control. You know how prideful Jamal can be. I was just a terrified older woman caught in the middle of a marital dispute. You cannot punish me for the sins of your husband. I always loved you, Kendra. I always saw your potential." My jaw tightened. The sheer lack of accountability was repulsive. "You stood in the mediation lobby drinking champagne out of a plastic cup, celebrating the fact that your son was trying to steal 20% of my life's work," I reminded her coldly. "You loudly proclaimed that God was punishing the wicked and rewarding your family with millions of dollars. You did not look terrified then, Loretta. You looked triumphant. You thought you had finally crushed the poor black girl from the wrong side of the tracks. You thought you could strip me of everything I built and parade my defeat around your social club. She began to hyperventilate. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps. Kendra, please, you do not understand what is happening here. The humiliation is going to kill me. She lowered her voice, dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper. Sister Wallace from the church auxiliary board just drove past my house slowly in her luxury sedan. She rolled her window down and stared at me sitting on a cardboard box. The entire neighborhood watch group is standing at the end of the cul-de-sac, pointing and whispering. Chloe posted a crying video on social media, blaming Jamal for her boutique closing, and now everyone thinks we are criminals. My reputation is completely destroyed. I will never be able to show my face at the country club again. She was not crying because she had lost her shelter. She was crying because she had lost her status. Her entire existence was built on looking down her nose at other women. She had spent decades cultivating an image of superior black excellence, masking the reality that they were drowning in consumer debt. She hosted lavish holiday dinners where she dictated who was worthy of a seat at the table. She had spent 3 years ensuring I sat at the very end of that table, treating me like domestic help rather than a daughter-in-law. Now she was the neighborhood spectacle, performing her own financial ruin, live for the very people she worshipped. You have endless amounts of cash, Kendra. Loretta pleaded, her tone shifting from begging to demanding. You run a massive commercial empire. I know you have the capital to fix this. You just need to call the bank. Tell them you are buying the house outright. You can put it in your company name and treat it as a real estate investment. I will pay you rent. I will do whatever you want. Just buy the house back from the bank and let me go back inside before the pastor's wife drives by and sees me like this. She was trying to negotiate a business deal while sitting on the curb. She genuinely believed my wealth was a tool designed specifically to rescue her from her own arrogant mistakes. She was so blinded by her entitlement that she thought she could order me to buy her a mansion as a favor. If you do this for me, Kendra, Loretta promised, her voice dripping with toxic manipulation, I will make sure the family welcomes you back with open arms. I will tell everyone at the church that you are a forgiving and generous daughter-in-law. I will make sure Jamal goes to counseling and fixes his attitude. We can put all this ugly business behind us and be a real family again. I will even let you host Thanksgiving dinner at the house next year. You just have to wire the funds to the bank right now. I listened to her frantic bargaining. She was offering me a seat at a table she no longer owned. She was granting me permission to host a dinner in a house she was just evicted from. The delusion was absolute. Loretta, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and flat. You need to stop talking and listen to me very carefully. She stopped crying instantly. Yes, Kendra, I am listening. Just tell me you are calling the bank. I am not calling the bank, Loretta, I stated clearly. And you need to stop begging the loan officers for a grace period. They cannot give you your keys back. They cannot negotiate a new mortgage rate with you or accept my capital to reinstate your deed. Why not? She shrieked, panic flooding her voice again. If you show them proof of funds, they have to let us buy it back. That is how real estate works. You just tell them you are the buyer and they hand over the paperwork. That is how traditional foreclosures work, I corrected her smoothly. But your son committed federal bank fraud. He used a defunct corporate shell to secure a predatory private equity loan. When Sterling Capital realized the collateral was toxic, they did not just seize your property. They immediately liquidated the asset to recoup their cash losses as quickly as possible. The bank does not own your pristine suburban estate anymore, Loretta. What do you mean they do not own it? She gasped, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Who owns it? They held a closed cash auction exactly 1 hour ago, I explained, savoring every single syllable. The property was sold to the highest bidder in a private commercial transaction. The deed has already been legally transferred and filed with the county. The new owner holds the absolute and permanent rights to the land and the structure. Who bought my house? Loretta demanded, her voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of rage and terror. Who bought my family legacy? Tell me their names so I can speak to them. I can explain the situation. I can make them understand that this is my home. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my polished mahogany desk. I looked out the window at the sprawling Chicago skyline, feeling the full weight of the empire I had built with my own two hands. Me. The dead silence on the other end of the phone was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I did not wait for Loretta to formulate a response. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I set my phone down on the polished mahogany desk and stood up. The digital clock on the wall read 2 in the afternoon. The county sheriff had officially completed the eviction sweep an hour ago. The property was legally vacant, and the title was resting safely in my corporate vault. It was time to inspect my new acquisition. I walked into the adjoining nursery. My luxury nanny Maria was softly singing to Zion and Zuri as they woke from their afternoon nap. I told Maria to bundle them up in their warmest designer coats. We were taking a family trip to the suburbs. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and selected my armor for the day. I slipped into a perfectly tailored camel trench coat over a crisp black turtleneck and wide-leg trousers. I stepped into a pair of black stiletto boots. The sharp-pointed heels were completely impractical for a moving day, but I was not there to lift boxes. I was there to crush whatever remaining pride my husband and his mother had left. The drive to the suburbs took exactly 45 minutes. I sat in the spacious back seat of my luxury SUV with Maria and my babies enjoying the smooth, quiet ride. As my driver turned onto Loretta's pristine cul-de-sac, the scene unfolding before me was a masterpiece of absolute misery. Moving day had hit its peak, and it was a complete and utter disaster. The 2 cheap rental trucks were parked unevenly on the driveway. The pristine landscaping Loretta used to obsess over was trampled and ruined by the heavy boots of day laborers who clearly did not care about preserving her precious grass. Standing in the center of the driveway, surrounded by a mountain of taped-up cardboard boxes and black plastic garbage bags, were the 3 people who had tried to destroy me: Jamal, Loretta, and Chloe. Chloe looked completely unrecognizable. The smug, entitled white woman who had spent years treating me like a charity case was now a weeping, shattered mess. Her expensive blonde hair was greasy and tied up in a messy knot. She was wearing baggy sweatpants completely stripped of the designer labels she used to flaunt at our family dinners. Trey had not just filed for divorce. He had completely locked her out of their accounts and handed her embezzlement files straight to his criminal defense lawyer. Chloe was facing severe felony charges for stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from a black man. Her wealthy country club friends had completely abandoned her the second the scandal hit the neighborhood group chats. She was standing in the driveway, sobbing into a crumpled tissue, begging Jamal for a cash advance that he absolutely did not have. Jamal was sweating profusely. He was trying to shove an oversized leather recliner into the back of the rental truck, his face twisted in physical exertion and sheer frustration. His custom suits were gone. He was wearing an old, faded university sweatshirt. He looked exactly like the bankrupt, desperate man he had become. The federal bank fraud investigation was breathing down his neck, and the toxic corporate debt from my shell company was permanently attached to his social security number. Loretta stood near the front porch, looking like a dethroned queen, observing the ruins of her conquered kingdom. She was clutching a framed portrait of her family tight against her chest. She had spent decades building her identity around this specific house. She used this address to prove she was better than everyone else. She used this driveway to lock me and her premature grandchildren out in a blinding blizzard because she thought my freelance money was not good enough to grace her holy presence. My driver pulled the sleek black SUV slowly up to the curb. The heavy tires crunched against the lingering ice and salt. The low purr of the engine cut through the sounds of Chloe's sobbing and Jamal's heavy breathing. They all stopped what they were doing. They turned and stared as my driver shifted the vehicle into park. I did not rush. I let them wait. I let them watch as my driver stepped out and walked around to my side of the vehicle. He opened the heavy door. I stepped out into the crisp winter air. The sharp, pointed heel of my stiletto struck the concrete with a loud, definitive click. It was the exact same pavement they had thrown my diaper bag onto just weeks prior. It was the exact same spot where I had stood freezing and humiliated holding my newborn babies, while Jamal slammed the door in my face. The concrete was dry now, but the memory of that blizzard hung heavy in the atmosphere between us. I stood tall, my tailored trench coat snapping lightly in the breeze. I did not look like a broken wife. I looked like the owner of the entire block. I turned back to the SUV and gave Maria a simple nod. She stayed safely inside the climate-controlled vehicle, cradling Zion and Zuri behind the tinted bulletproof glass. My children were completely untouchable. I turned my attention back to the driveway and began to walk forward. Every single step I took echoed loudly against the pavement. Click, click, click. The sound was a countdown to their absolute destruction. Chloe was the first to break. She stumbled forward, dropping her crumpled tissue. Her face was red and blotchy, her eyes swollen from days of crying. She rushed toward me, her hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Kendra. Please, Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking with desperation. You have to tell Trey to drop the charges. You have to tell him I was just confused about the finances. I have nothing, Kendra. My accounts are frozen. My boutique is gone. I am sleeping on an air mattress in my sister's basement. Please just call him and tell him to show some mercy. We are family. You know I always supported your little design business. I did not stop walking. I did not even break my stride. I looked right through her, as if she were completely invisible. You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a hard-working black man to fund your white savior complex. Chloe, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly cold. You smiled in my face while secretly draining your husband's future to buy luxury candles. Family does not embezzle from family. You are a thief. Enjoy your air mattress. Chloe gasped, clutching her chest, as if I had physically struck her. She crumpled back against a stack of moving boxes, sobbing uncontrollably. I did not spare her another glance. I kept walking right up the center of the driveway. Jamal dropped the edge of the leather recliner. It hit the metal ramp of the moving truck with a loud bang. He marched down the driveway to intercept me, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He was trying to summon that arrogant masculine authority he loved to project, but his eyes were completely hollow. He was a defeated man, trying to play the tough guy. What are you doing here, Kendra? Jamal demanded, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of anger and absolute humiliation. You already took everything. You set me up with that toxic debt. You called the private lender. You ruined my corporate career. Did you just come here to gloat? Did you come to take pictures of us packing our bags so you can show off to your rich new friends? I stopped walking, standing exactly 3 feet away from the man who used to demand my grocery receipts. I looked him up and down, taking in his stained sweatshirt and his trembling hands. I do not need to gloat, Jamal. I replied, my tone completely devoid of emotion. I am simply conducting a final walkthrough of my new real estate acquisition. I need to ensure the previous tenants have not caused any structural damage to the property before my demolition crew arrives. Jamal blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process my words. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The reality of the phone call I had just had with his mother was finally hitting him. He realized I was not speaking metaphorically. I was speaking as the legal title holder of the ground he was currently standing on. Before Jamal could formulate a response, a piercing shriek echoed across the yard. Loretta charged down the porch steps. She completely abandoned the elegant, dignified persona she had spent 40 years cultivating. She looked unhinged. She sprinted across the driveway, her arms flailing wildly as she positioned herself directly between me and the front door of the house. Loretta planted her feet wide apart. She spread her arms out, trying to physically block my path to the entryway. Her chest heaved, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate madness. She was practically vibrating with rage. "You are not taking one single step inside this house!" Loretta screamed, her voice cracking and echoing down the entire street. I do not care what papers you signed with that bank. I do not care how much money you wired them. This is my home. This is the house my husband built. This is my history. You are a common street rat who manipulated my son, and now you think you can just buy my legacy. I stood perfectly still. I looked at the frantic, desperate woman trying to block a door she no longer owned. The wealthy neighbors who had been quietly observing from their porches were now openly staring at the spectacle. Loretta's pristine reputation was bleeding out onto the concrete. "Get off my property!" Loretta shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You are trespassing on my legacy. You do not belong here. You will never belong here. Turn around, get back in your flashy car, and go back to the gutter you came from. You will not cross this threshold. I will physically remove you myself if I have to." She stepped forward, raising her hands as if she was actually preparing to push me off the driveway. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, fully prepared to deliver the final lethal blow that would wipe her imaginary kingdom completely off the map. I did not step back. I stood my ground on the freezing concrete and looked at the frantic, desperate woman trying to guard a kingdom she had already lost. Loretta was panting heavily, her arms spread wide across the doorway of the sprawling brick estate. The wealthy neighbors who had gathered at the edges of their manicured lawns were watching with bated breath. The moving crew had completely stopped loading boxes into the rental trucks, leaning against the metal ramps to witness the spectacle. I reached inside my tailored camel trench coat. I did not pull out a single sheet of paper. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound architectural portfolio. I walked right past Loretta, completely ignoring her frantic screaming, and slammed the heavy portfolio down flat onto the hood of my luxury SUV. I unzipped the leather casing and unrolled a massive, glossy master development blueprint. Loretta stopped yelling. Her eyes darted from my face down to the sprawling blueprints illuminated by the harsh winter sunlight. Jamal slowly walked over his shoulders, slumped his faded sweatshirt covered in dust. He stared down at the documents, his eyes scanning the official city zoning stamps and the intricate architectural renderings. "You think this is just about a deed, Loretta?" I said, my voice projecting clearly across the icy driveway. "You think I came here just to hand you an eviction notice and take the keys to your house? I do not want to live in this monument to your fake superiority. I am not moving in. I am tearing it down." Loretta gasped, clutching her chest. "You cannot demolish my home," she whispered, her voice cracking with sheer terror. "It is not your home anymore," I corrected her sharply. "And I did not just buy this single property. Look at the perimeter lines on the blueprint, Jamal. I am sure a corporate finance genius like yourself can read a standard commercial survey." Jamal traced his shaking finger along the thick black lines printed on the glossy paper. He swallowed hard, the color draining completely from his face. "You bought the Miller property next door?" He stammered, his voice barely audible. "You bought the corner lot." "I bought the entire cul-de-sac," I announced, turning to face the gossiping neighbors who were suddenly standing much closer to their property lines. I spent the last 3 days quietly acquiring the 3 surrounding properties in cash transactions. My commercial development firm has already secured the demolition permits from the city council. Tomorrow morning, a fleet of bulldozers will pull onto this exact street, and every single brick of your precious legacy is coming down. Loretta let out a guttural, devastating wail. She collapsed against the brick pillar of the front porch, sliding down until she hit the cold concrete. "What are you building?" Jamal asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Why would you spend millions of dollars just to level a luxury suburban block?" I rolled up the blueprints and slid them back into the leather portfolio. "I am building a state-of-the-art community outreach center and transitional housing complex for at-risk mothers," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am building a safe, warm, highly secured haven for women who have been financially abused and discarded. I am creating a sanctuary for mothers who need shelter from the cold, mothers who have been thrown out into blizzards by weak, cowardly men." Jamal flinched as if I had struck him across the face. He looked frantically at the neighbors who were now openly whispering and pointing at him. He tried to puff out his chest, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of his masculine pride remained. "You are doing this out of pure spite, Kendra," he shouted, trying to raise his voice to drown out the murmurs of the crowd. "You are a bitter, broke designer who just happened to get lucky with a few good real estate investments. You are tearing apart our family over a simple misunderstanding. I am the father of your children. You owe me respect." I laughed, a sharp cutting sound that echoed off the empty rental trucks. I turned my back to the SUV and faced the entire neighborhood. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I synced it to the massive surround sound system built into my vehicle. I turned the volume to the absolute maximum. "You want to talk about respect, Jamal?" I asked, pressing a button on my screen. "You want to talk about how I am just a broke designer, making up stories about a simple misunderstanding? Let us share the truth with your lovely neighbors." The heavy bass of my vehicle speakers hummed to life. Then the crystal-clear audio from the security camera across the street began to blast through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Everyone heard the sound of the howling wind. Then they heard Loretta screaming that I was a gold-digging fraud. Then Jamal's voice boomed across the driveway, sharp and cruel. My mother was right. I should have married a woman in my own tax bracket, not some struggling freelancer who drains my paycheck every single month. The neighbors gasped. The day laborers working for the moving company shook their heads in absolute disgust. The audio continued playing, the heart-wrenching sound of 10-day-old Zion wailing in the freezing cold. It played the heavy slam of the front door and the decisive click of the deadbolt, locking us out to freeze. I cut the audio. The silence that followed was heavier than the blizzard itself. "I subsidized your entire fraudulent life," I stated, my voice slicing through the winter air like a blade. "I paid for the luxury car you drove. I guaranteed the platinum credit cards you flashed at expensive steakhouses. I bought the designer suits you wore to pretend you were important. You lived in my shadow for 3 years, and the moment you felt threatened, you tried to let my babies freeze to death." Jamal broke. The reality of his absolute poverty, his insurmountable federal debt, and his public humiliation crushed him into dust. His knees buckled, hitting the icy concrete with a sickening thud. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. He grabbed the hem of his mother's skirt and then reached his shaking hands out toward my stiletto boots. "Kendra, please," he begged, sobbing openly in front of the entire neighborhood. "Please give me another chance. I was wrong. I was so stupid. She made me do it." He pointed a trembling finger at his own mother, throwing her directly to the wolves. "Loretta poisoned my mind. She hated you from the beginning, and she forced me to choose her. I love you, Kendra. I love Zion and Zuri. You cannot leave me with nothing. Please take me back." I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling on the concrete. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no sorrow, just complete and total indifference. "You threw away a dynasty for your pride," I said, delivering the final lethal blow. "My twins will inherit an empire. You will inherit a studio apartment." I turned around and stepped smoothly into the heated back seat of my SUV. I did not look back as my driver pulled away from the curb, leaving Jamal sobbing on the pavement, and Loretta screaming into her hands as the moving crew began tossing their boxed-up lives into the back of a cheap rental truck. The harsh Chicago winter eventually broke, giving way to a brilliant and beautiful spring. The dust from the explosions I set off finally settled, and the legal and financial devastation I left in my wake was absolute. Jamal was completely ruined. He was currently working a grueling entry-level corporate job, sitting in a cramped gray cubicle taking orders from managers a decade younger than him. He did not get to keep his salary. His wages were aggressively garnished by the federal government and the private equity firm to pay off the $500,000 toxic debt from the shell company he had so proudly claimed. He lived in a tiny dark studio apartment far away from the elite downtown restaurants he used to frequent. He took the bus to work because his luxury car lease had been terminated. He had zero custody of Zion and Zuri. He was granted supervised visitation for exactly 2 hours a month, and he had to pay for the court monitor out of his own diminished pocket. Loretta was banished from the suburbs entirely. She was living in a cramped 2-bedroom rental in a neighborhood she used to mock at her dinner parties. Her precious country club immediately revoked her membership the moment the foreclosure became public record. The church auxiliary board quietly asked her to step down, citing her family scandal as a distraction to their holy mission. When she walked down the street to buy discount groceries, the women she used to judge actively looked the other way. She had no estate, no legacy, and no social standing. She was utterly alone, trapped in a prison of her own making. Chloe had simply vanished. When Trey realized the full extent of her embezzlement, he did not protect her. He filed for divorce and handed my leather-bound forensic accounting folder straight to the district attorney. Chloe was facing severe felony theft charges. Stripped of her fake luxury lifestyle and her white savior complex, she fled Chicago, likely hiding in a relative's basement out of state, terrified of her impending trial. I did not think about them anymore. I sat in my sunlit glass-walled office, overlooking the breathtaking Chicago skyline. The morning light poured across the imported marble floors and warmed the massive mahogany desk where I managed my growing commercial empire. In the corner of the sprawling office, Zion and Zuri were playing happily on a plush custom rug. They were bigger now, healthy and thriving, completely insulated by generational wealth and unshakable security. Maria, my trusted nanny, sat nearby reading a book, but I was the one truly in charge of my domain. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, resting my hand against the warm glass. I looked out over the city I had conquered. I had stripped away the false humility. I had stopped shrinking myself to make weak people comfortable. I had reclaimed my power, my identity, and my absolute peace. They thought the cold would break me. They didn't realize I was the storm. The most profound lesson to take away from this story is that true power does not require volume or validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. When toxic people try to strip you of your dignity, they often rely on the assumption that you are entirely dependent on their approval and resources. Building your own foundation in silence gives you the ultimate leverage to walk away from abuse without hesitation. You do not owe loyalty to anyone who uses your vulnerability as a weapon. Protect your peace, guard your assets, and never apologize for knowing your actual worth. If you found the courage in this story inspiring, make sure to share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and subscribe to the channel for more empowering content.